From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Cole on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another edition of Cole on Congress. We're truly honored today to have with us a genuine American hero in Congressman Sam Johnson of Texas. Congressman Johnson served in the United States Air Force for 29 years during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. While on his second tour of duty during Vietnam, Congressman Johnson was shot down and held captive for nearly 7 years, 42 months of those spent in solitary confinement. After he was released from captivity, he returned home to Texas as a decorated fighter pilot. Sam Johnson is now one of the most compelling advocates for making sure our troops have the funding and training necessary to successfully complete their mission in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's an honor to serve with him in Congress and a real treat to have him here with us today. Congressman Johnson, thank you for being here. More importantly, thank you for your service to our country.
My pleasure, sir.
My honor to have you here, Congressman. You know, one of the great reads, really, in, I think, modern American literature, certainly for people that are interested in those who served our country, is your own book, Captive Warriors. It describes your experience in Vietnam and, frankly, some of the horrific things that you went through. Tell us a little bit about that, and how in the world did you manage to survive the challenges that you faced in that environment?
Well, I praise the Lord for helping us through that episode in our life. I had a lot of good people around me, and we talked together by tapping on the wall. And I think the first episode that I had happened to me when I was there cemented the way I was going to react and respond, and that is they blindfolded me one night and took me out and to a trial and said, "You're guilty, we're going to kill you." War criminal, they called us. And they blindfolded me again and marched me out into the jungle. And when they took the blindfold off, I was standing in front of a slit trench and facing 5 guys with AK-47 rifles, and an officer standing there, and I prayed to the Lord like I never prayed before. I used to have to go to Sunday school and church every Sunday. My mother made me. But I really didn't know the Lord until that very moment. And when he said fire, those guns went click, 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 click. And I praised the Lord. And I don't know what made me do it, but I laughed at them. And they kicked me in the slit trench and left me there for a while. But from that point forward, I never had any fear of them. And because I knew the Lord was with me. That carried me through. And, I had flown every airplane that the Air Force had up to that point and fired every weapon that we'd ever had because I was at the fighter weapons school. In fact, I was amazed that they never found out, and I praise the Lord for that, too, because they would have really put the screws to me if they'd have known I'd been subject to all that information.
I want to be a little parochial here. One of the people that were with you through that horrific ordeal was the late Howard Rutledge. He actually lived in Norman, Oklahoma in the last part of his life. Ran for Congress a couple times.
Right.
Very nearly won in 1980.
Howie Rutledge, when we were put in a place we called Alcatraz, where they had 11 of us in single cells, in 11 different cells. There were 13 cells in the place in an L shape, and Howie was 2 cells down from me, and so you get to know a guy pretty well when you're in those circumstances, even though you're just tapping on the wall talking to each other, and they would punish you if they caught you tapping, talking. They didn't want you to talk, but we learned to do it quiet enough so that they couldn't hear us, and I tell you, Howie Rutledge and Harry Jenkins were the 2 guys to my right, immediate right, and both Navy. And I tell you what I learned more about boats than anybody ever want to know. In the time we were there, that was a period of time when we were all in leg irons for 2.5 years.
He later wrote a couple of wonderful books. The first one, In the Presence of Mine Enemies, which was about his ordeal.
Yep.
And then later, in the Presence of Mine Friends, about some of the challenges that you deal with in a post-imprisonment situation.
Howie would have made a good representative. It's a shame he didn't get elected.
It really
He would have
is.
done a good job for Oklahoma.
No question about it. And that was back when that district was very, very heavily Democrat. And again, he came with it was a whisker. It was like 1,000 votes.
Yeah.
He almost made it. But anyway, obviously you did make it. What made you decide to run for office after such a distinguished military
Well,
career?
that's, those same guys and the others in that group, we decided we got tired of listening to the bad mouth from the United States, which is some of what you're hearing right now. Instead of griping about what the president's doing or griping about what the Congress is doing, and we all decided, well, let's get involved and try to get elected and see if we can't make some changes directly. And that's what put the seed in my brain, I guess, to begin with.
What are the similarities and differences you see today, Congressman, between the situation we're facing in Afghanistan, Iraq, the situation we were dealing with earlier in your career in Vietnam?
Well, the similarity is that the people in the United States don't like long, drawn-out wars, and that's been true ever since our Revolutionary War, every one of them. It's just disheartening to think that they want to pull the plug on our troops. And in Vietnam, when we did that, they had it won. The South was free, and the North had already backed off. And then we decided we were going to pull the plug on money with the U.S. Congress, and consequently, the North sensed a weakness and attacked. And I'm scared to death that same thing will happen here. It may break out in a civil war instead of a overtake, but either way, it's the same event. There is a big difference, though, and I don't think the public realizes that we're fighting a war against terror. It's not a country versus country. It's not communism versus democracy. It's flat out terrorism, and if we don't think about it in those terms and stay the course and be with our guys and support them, and they're doing a great job, by the way, I think we're making a huge mistake, and it'll affect us in the future.
Right now, obviously, we've got, it's very confusing, I think, for the average American to try to tell who's who in this particular conflict. You've got a Sunni and Shia conflict. Obviously, you have a Kurdish element in the country as well. You've got Al-Qaeda active. When you go home and you talk to your constituents, how do you explain to them that this is not exclusively a civil war? Nobody wants to be caught in a civil war. How do you explain to them that there are other actors involved?
Well, fortunately, I think my district is similar to yours. They're not worried about that. I don't think any of them think it's a civil war, but the way the Democrat element up here and a lot of the press play it, they're trying to beat the drum for a civil war, and I don't think it's a civil war at all. It's a terrorist element getting in there and trying to foment conflict between those two elements that you mentioned. And now that they've found oil in the Sunni, I guess it is, area, I don't see where there's a problem. They were worried about oil, and the dollar's flowing, and they've come to a conclusion of how to divide those profits among all elements of Iraq. I think that's going to go a long way towards solving any, quote, civil war idea among them. And, frankly, you heard the ex-prime minister over here talking. He thinks they're making progress. He thinks our surge is working, and it appears that they're going to solve their own problems. And if they can take over the civil operation of that country and rebuild the schools and rebuild, the roads and things that make a country work, then we're way ahead of the power curve, I think.
What do you think the importance of a successful Iraq in the Middle East would be from an American perspective?
My goodness, they're a buffer between the Muslim world who wants to destroy Israel, Britain, and the United States, and the really radical elements. It's the radical Muslims that we have to worry about. They're not all radical, but there are a lot of them, and they're the ones that are pushing the boat right now.
There's a lot of speculation in the United States. I think sometimes we forget what the world with Saddam Hussein was like. And what it might have meant had he been allowed to continue in power there, particularly since he was getting out from under UN restrictions. There hadn't been any weapons inspectors in there in 4 or 5 years. There certainly was a country that had sort of gamed the oil for food situation. It's maybe an interesting game to play historical what-ifs, but how do you think things would have evolved had we allowed Saddam to remain there?
Well, I might ask you that question. I think that the terrorism would just be worse, and it would be here in the United States and not over there. As you know, those countries that are radical, and they call them a lot of different names. Al-Qaeda's not the only thing going over there. There's several of them. They want to reconquer for the radical Muslim world, not just the Middle East, but all of Africa, North Africa in particular, and all of Southern Europe, all the way to England, for goodness sake. I don't understand that thought process. I mean, they've got some good countries over there, and they ought to try to live within them. Iran is the real problem, I believe, and I think you would agree with me.
Oh, no question about that. I still, focusing again, though, on Iraq for just a second, and then talking about the Iranians, I think Americans tend to forget this was a country that launched 2 regional wars that killed 1 million people. We got drawn into one of them. Saddam,
they were shooting at us.
They were shooting at our guys in the no-fly zones. They were financing terrorism against Israel. And that was, with them constricted. And the idea that Saddam could never cooperate with Al-Qaeda, I think, is just historically fanciful. I mean, the reality is enemies can cooperate against a common enemy. Our own experience, cooperating with the Soviet Union against Germany in World War II is a pretty good indication. If you don't like somebody bad enough, you can set aside your differences. And I just have never had much doubt that Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda would have the ability to do that left on their own. Very dangerous enemy for us.
Well, even though there were no nuclear weapons found, it was obvious that he had the ability to build them if we'd have left him alone.
Well, you mentioned the Iranians. So how do you see them? What kind of role do you see them playing in the Middle East? What should our attitude be vis-a-vis them?
I believe that guy's scary as heck because he's really crazy and has no rudder, I don't think. You don't know what he's going to do from one minute to the next. And I had some Iranians in the Dallas area tell me to please keep us out of there for a while because they're going to overthrow him. I hope that's true. They understand that what's happening is not in the best interest of the general public of Iran. And, of course, they had a freer economy at one time, and so it's not something new to them like it is in Iraq.
Yeah, absolutely. We've actually gotten a surprising amount of, maybe not direct help, but the Europeans have actually been willing to condemn what's going on, repeated violations, the UN. This is, not a country that's whose activities have been sanctioned by anybody.
Well, if they do develop nukes, nuclear weapons, I think that the way that guy's been acting, they would use them. And that's another whole big problem.
It really is. What do you? And we get so focused, and appropriately so, because we've got men and women in action in Afghanistan and Iraq. But looking beyond that for a moment, how do you see, as a career military person, the security threats that the United States is going to face over the next generation or so? What would you point to as the things we ought to be most concerned about?
Well, we ought not to draw down our military. As you know, right now, everybody wants to have a smaller Air Force, a smaller Navy, and a smaller Army, and we don't need them anymore because we're the strongest power in the world. Well, in the Air Force terminology, they keep saying, we don't need fighters anymore. We got air superiority. I would challenge them, how in the devil do you think we got air superiority in the first place? Huh? It was with superior fighters and the ability to protect the airspace wherever we go in the world. And we're getting more into drones nowadays and, automated vehicles. I mean, we have the ability to pinpoint a mortar when it's fired and go back to it, except they're all gone. But, we have a tremendous capability in this country, and we can't stop innovations that come about in the military, nor should we stop building new equipment and putting it in the field and making sure that our guys are the best armed and the best protected of any soldier in the world. And they are right now. People who talk about us in Iraq not having the equipment, they're full of it, I tell you, because you've been there and so have I, and they're fully equipped, and we got the latest stuff. In fact, in our district in Garland, Texas, they build armored trucks. And they're building a Humvee now that's armored, that for goodness sake has this big thing on the front glass that will stop a rocket. I mean,
jeez,
come on.
Well,
it weighs a ton.
I think that's one of the things that most Americans, it's easy to miss. I mean, the loss of any life is horrific. And certainly I think we all have had experiences. We've lost people in our congressional districts. I know I've been to a number of funerals, and they're heartbreaking. But you also have to recognize when the military has done a remarkable job in protecting its own. The casualty rate for the numbers deployed is maybe the lowest in American military history, which says a lot about the professionalism, the equipping, the training that this particular force
Well,
has.
and until a couple days ago, we haven't had any prisoners taken either, and I hope they find those guys.
Oh, gosh, that's just horrific to think about what those gentlemen may be going through, and their families clearly are going through right now. But, well, let me ask you again, you mentioned we do have a very well-equipped force, but didn't we in the 1990s make maybe exactly that mistake that you were talking about? We certainly after the end of the Cold War and after the first Iraqi War, we reduced the size of our military by about 40% in terms of manpower. We skipped a generation of weapons procurement, and we find ourselves now with a very good force, but one that's stretched very thin in terms of its size.
That's right. And part of the problem, again, was with the Congress. The United States Congress failed to reduce the Guard in the same strength that we reduced the regular force. And so that's why they're having to use so many Guard and Reserve guys nowadays, because they're just not on active duty. We need a larger Army in place so we can take care of protecting the United States of ours wherever we need to. And we don't need to rob from the Air Force and Navy to build the Army. We've got to keep a strong force. And I think if you look at the percentage of our gross national product, the military is way down.
It's pretty staggering. My dad was a career Air Force non-com, and I remember in the late 50s, early 60s when he was still in, we were spending almost 8 or 9% of our gross national product on defense. Now, that may be higher than you need, but it was 6 by the time Ronald Reagan was president. It got down to 3.5 when Bush 41 was president. It's still under 4, or right about 4 today.
About 4.
So it's hard to believe that, actually I've read that this is now the lowest percentage of our national wealth we spent in defending ourselves since 1940, the eve of the Second World War.
That's exactly right, and I think that's a little scary. I hope that we can reverse that trend. When Carter was president, is where it took a biggest nosedive. I was commander down at Homestead Air Force Base at the time, and I'll tell you what, we couldn't get anything. And parts for aircraft, we were cannibalizing off other aircraft to keep the ones flying that we had. So, I don't know how much percentage-wise, but I'll bet you it was close to a third of the force was inactive because we were taking parts off of one to make another one fly. And that's double work, as you know.
It is, and the age is something. We have of course we have a large depot at Tinker Air Force Base, and those guys. My dad worked there 20 years after he was out of the Air Force. They do a marvelous job keeping very old aircraft, but most Americans don't realize them. We've got, let's take the KC-135 tanker fleet that flows through Tinker Air Force Base. Now, when most of those things were built in the late 50s and early 60s, my dad was actually one of the two senior non-coms in the United States Air Force, so he helped design the maintenance routines for them. Then he worked on it. He retired in 1960. He worked on it for 20 years until 1981. He died in 2000, and those same airplanes are still coming through Tinker Air Force Base. They're literally, pushing half a century old in some cases.
Well, look at a B-52.
Right.
Those B-52s, if you ever get in one, you look at the wrinkled skin on the outside of one. I was able to fly one at Seymour Johnson when I got back from POW deal, and it was a little scary. I didn't want to get in the airplane. And they had the latest models there. And I don't ever want to get in another one either. It's slow as Christmas.
Well, that's one of the big challenges.
The C-5's another one they do at Tinker, don't they?
Yeah, they certainly do.
And that airplane is, they had so much trouble with it a few years ago, and even up until last year, as recently as last year, that every time it flew, it broke down, and they'd have to take parts to it.
It's incredible, and I tell you, the skills of these guys, that literally, they're almost like craftsmen. They're not. It's an industrial operation, but you've got to be able to fix very unique problems on those airplanes one at a time. Because when they age, they all age differently.
Well, they don't build them anymore, so there's no parts worldwide. So we have to furnish the parts wherever they go, and if we had listened to the Pentagon when they were trying to buy new tankers, which, as you know, one of our friends stopped, we would have had 747s. 757s,
yeah.
I think, as a tanker, and that's a commercial airplane, and you can get parts for it all over the world. That makes sense to me.
I think we're going to have to revisit that issue because, again,
well, they are. They've gone out for bids again. I can't believe it, and to think that we would even think about giving that contract to a foreign country bugs me a little bit.
Yeah, it worries me a little bit too about maintaining our own industrial base. You've
Right.
got to have the ability to make these kinds of things at home. This is really a national security question.
I agree with you totally.
What looking forward? Obviously, we've made some steps this year. We're going to increase the size of the Army. Better late than never. But it's very difficult to know what the right size of the force ought to be. We dropped down at the end of the Cold War. We had about 2.2 or 3 million people, I understand, in active service. It's about 1.4 today. If you were looking ahead, if you could put a number on it, got any idea where we ought to go?
No, I don't. I can't begin to tell you what is needed. You just have to look at all the requirements, and some of them are silly requirements. Like we still have a force in Egypt over there in the Sinai, and not many, but there's some there.
Well, 45th Infantry Brigade did a year there.
There are little forces like that all over the world. We need to start cutting back on some of those and figure out whether we really need them in those places or not. I mean, Israel and Egypt have been at peace for a long time now, and I don't really think that we ought to keep that kind of thing going. That's just one example. We got them all over the world. I don't know what kind. I don't think we can be the world's policeman, but neither do I want the UN to do it.
Well, and that's, therein lies the problem. So many of these things seem to evolve back to us as one of the big challenges. I think you were here. If I recall, you were elected in a special election in 1991. So when we were dealing with the situation in Kosovo and Bosnia, I remember somebody sitting outside of Congress thinking, my goodness, that's Europe's neighborhood. I mean, can't the Germans and the French and the English there's genocide going on in that area, and there clearly was. Why do they need America to act that close to their own home?
Yeah, I was over there too, visited when I was in the Congress, and our guys did a super job. And in fact, believe it or not, the Russians were working with us too. And then we let the UN in, and they made a mess of it for a long, long time. And that's why I don't believe the UN is capable of solving a problem in a war situation like that with multinational troops, because they all think differently.
Well, one of our challenges too is if you look at the European military forces, and they're friends and allies, but they don't have much ability to project power. They don't have much airlift capacity at all.
Right.
So even when they're going to deploy,
they call on us to do it.
Absolutely. And you saw again American capability in the tsunami a couple of years ago. It took only the United States had the ability to reach that far away and into those kind of areas. So maintaining that kind of capability, it's frustrating because other countries, particularly our friends in Western Europe, seem to overly rely on the American military to protect them.
I know. Well, Japan's changing their rules, and I think they will evolve into a stronger military power, and I don't know if that's good or bad based on history.
I have to share an interesting story with you, if I may. That reminds me of something. I had an uncle who did 3.5 years in Japanese prison camp. He was a sailor, and he was on a little gunboat in the Yangtze River. They pulled those back into Manila, and they couldn't fight Japanese fleet with those, so they scuttled him and gave him a rifle, turned him into an infantryman, and he fought at Bataan and was captured there, did the Bataan Death March, and was at Cabanatuan prison camp, and then at the end of the war had been sent to the main islands in Japan. And his stepfather, my grandfather, was a Navy captain, a little minesweeper, and he was off the coast clearing the areas they thought the invasion was going to take place in, that the atom bomb cut short. My uncle always used to say on that, he said, thank goodness for Harry Truman, the atom bomb, because I wouldn't have been alive. We were told we were going to be killed if there was an American invasion. But he made the point. I remember 60 years later, I happened to be with Speaker Hastert, and I was sitting with the Japanese Prime Minister, and we were talking about the forces they had deployed in Iraq, the oil tankers they had in the Persian Gulf supporting coalition war, the $4 billion check they write us to help us maintain our forces in Japan. I thought, my goodness, my grandfather and uncle would have never, ever believed 60 years later we'd be talking to the Japanese Prime Minister as a friend, that their nephew and grandson would be doing that. So what we do does change the world sometimes.
Oh, it does, and I think with Japan as a friend over there, we're kind of buttressing up against China, and we need them.
Well, Congressman, we're just about to wrap out of time, but I want to thank you for coming today to join us. We appreciate your service to the United States as a soldier and a congressman, and there's no doubt that in the global war for terror, the greatest challenge our nation has faced in a generation, you're one of the strong voices that has spoken out about where this country needs to go. As our soldiers continue to fight for America's freedom, rest assured that I'll be supporting them the entire way, and I know, frankly, you will be. You've been the leader in that fight, so I look forward to bringing more insightful episodes in the future, but I think we're going to be hard-placed to outdo you, Sam. I feel that way, and I know my colleagues do. Every day that I walk on the floor with you, I feel like I get to be in Congress an American hero.
Well, I believe in the United States of America, and I know you do, too. God bless America.
Oh, God bless us all. And again, till next time, thank you very much, Sam, for being here. It's a great honor to have you.
Thank you, sir.